All right, we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of In Lay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Ascari, and we have my friend Regina back with me. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me back, Payman.
No, anytime. Thank you so much for agreeing to come back on. Um, Regina, I think at this point everybody knows who you are, but I don't know, just a brief introduction. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm not sure if everybody knows who I am, but I'm more popular than I was, 6 months ago. So my name is Regina Watteel. I have a PhD in statistics, and I've been, fighting against the bogus science that was used to prop up vaccine mandates and passports. And I recently wrote a book called Fisman's Fraud: The Rise of Canadian Hate Science, and that goes through how the federal government turned to fraudulent research when the real data could no longer support their mandates and restrictions. When I say no longer support, it's actually they never had the science to back them. So,
All right. Well, I got you. You and I, we met in Ottawa, and we kind of decided that you were going to come on, and we were going to talk about things how they've changed regarding the book you released. But then you hit me with this massive court case. So could you give the audience a little description of what that case is about?
okay. I was contacted a few days ago. A detective actually sent me the ruling for the City of Ottawa versus the Union here, and just wondered if I had seen the ruling. And basically, it was ruled that the City of Ottawa was reasonable in its vaccination policy for the workers. And this vaccination policy was in effect from 2021, the fall of 2021, to April of 2022 for most workers, and extended to, I think, May of 2023 for select workers. And basically, the City of Ottawa, the ruling was found in their favor. But when you go through the case, it it seemed to me that it was thrown by the union, that they did not really represent the unvaccinated workers. So I think a lot of people who know me know that I'm very upset with how workers were treated throughout the pandemic. The unvaccinated workers, they were treated horribly. Um, so I do get, you know, upset when I see these type of rulings, and I do get upset when I see that the union is not representing its workers the way it's supposed to.
So when you say they threw the case, you told me that basically they didn't argue whether or not the vaccines were effective. They just shied away from that, and they basically argued that the way that the Ottawa went about it was just to reduce cost. What was the argument that you took offense to?
Well, there's actually a lot of things that are wrong with this. So I can go through maybe the main issues that I had with the union stance. We went back and forth a little bit with this payment, and you were right on board. You can anybody who's been unfairly treated because of these mandates can read this case and see that it is like the union did a terrible job, like beyond terrible. Um, so I'll start with the most obvious. The most obvious thing is that the union didn't challenge the city's evidence, the facts of the case. They kind of agreed with the union's stance on a lot of things, including that the vaccines were safe and effective. The union even wrote in their, it's even written in this ruling, something that shows that the unions believe in the whole false narrative that the unvaccinated are a greater risk to others. So I can't see that helping the case. Um, they also agreed with the Ontario Science Table being independent and a credible source for COVID-19 vaccination, and as well as the Public Health Agency of Canada and Public Health. Blanket statements about credibility and independence. They didn't challenge any of the evidence put forth by these organizations. So right away, there's going to be an issue, right? They didn't. Do you want to care to comment on that's the first thing, that they didn't challenge the facts?
I'll add something to that. So I'm going to give you my non-legal interpretation of that. All of these cases I look at, and there was one with Bonnie Henry here in BC. We lost that one too. And it seems like the government, they come in and they have like a three-piece suit, and you got like a prosecutor that's like perfectly built and fit. And then the defense, it's like this fat hillbilly farmer, like manure on his shoes. Like that's what the impression I get when I read these things. Because like the government's position, they're like the ministry of such and such release conclusively this argument. And then ours is like, yeah, there was this one, I don't know, one article somewhere that said that maybe, this, that happened. So I feel like we have to step up our game.
Step it up. I mean, it doesn't look like they even started. And again, I guess we should both say that we are not lawyers. So I'm not looking at this as, I'm not giving legal advice here. What I'm looking at this as a statistician looking at the evidence that was presented. So it's kind of a critique of the evidence and basically also what I would have expected if a union was representing me, what I would have expected them to present and what they did not present. All right. So we'll go a little bit more into the whole not challenging of the facts and why it's so the city's facts and why it's such a problem. But the second thing that's pretty obvious is the union didn't even establish their own facts that would help out their case. All right. Like you don't see that in here. One of the things that I would expect to be in here is a timeline of events regarding the COVID-19 transmission pre and post the vaccine mandates. Because if you simply go through the timeline, and these are recorded factual events, it shows that these mandates are ridiculous. So all you have to do is kind of go through, facts that are on record. So they should really be undisputed in that sense. These are records. So, I mean, there probably meet some resistance bringing this stuff in, but if I just quickly went through the timeline of events, Payman, you would start like in, say, May of 2021, before the mandates came in. And at that time, we already knew that there was breakthrough cases, right? Breakthrough cases were becoming the norm. The CDC in the US, for example, stopped reporting most breakthrough cases because there were so many, and they only reported ones that resulted in hospitalization. That was 2021. Right? And then we have, by the summer of 2021, massive outbreaks in mostly vaccinated venues. So you've seen the outbreaks, for example, in Massachusetts. There's almost 500 people who got COVID following Independence Day celebration. 74% of those were vaccinated individuals. That everybody knows. It was in the papers. It was, it was a well-known case. But also in the summer of 2021, you had that resurgence in Israel. Israel had approved its third dose, and Israel was warning all the other countries that 2 doses wouldn't be enough. It's also known that these vaccines waned, their immunity waned. And what else do I say on that? Anyway, that's all been established summer 2021 before the mandates. So then the mandates come in the fall of 2021. And the case that I'm talking about, Ottawa versus the Union, the city of Ottawa versus the Union, we're in Ontario. And Ontario had recorded the statistics of cases by vaccine status. All right. So Government of Ontario data is available. And that data shows that in the Omicron surge, it shows that the vaccinated had disproportionately more cases. They had higher incident rates. Why isn't that in here? This is on record. That's what the Government of Ontario data showed. So you can just go through the timeline of events, and it does not look good for these mandates. It shows many things. One thing that both parties should have been able to agree on was that the vaccine doesn't stop transmission, right? At the very least, we're going to argue more than that it doesn't curtail it at all and actually could make it worse. But I think all parties should have been able to agree that it doesn't stop transmission. Why isn't that in here? I would also want to put in there that right now, the majority of Canadians have had COVID-19, have they not? The majority of Canadians, that we can give sources for that. And also that the majority have been vaccinated. Those are very simple facts that both parties should have been able to agree on, right? What I also found very interesting is that they talked about Directive 6 in this this ruling. So here in Ontario, the Ontario government, Karine Moore, the Minister of Health, he actually put out a Directive 6 where they had to come up with, like hospitals, etc., had to come up with vaccination policies. All right. But Dr. Moore was very specific when he said that that does not mean vaccine mandates, that he expected employers to have options available to unvaccinated workers, like rapid antigen testing and that type of thing. So he's been on record as saying Directive 6 was not a mandatory vaccination. It was for employers to come up with policy about vaccination. But you don't see in this ruling the union mentioning that Ontario did not bring in a vaccination policy, like a mandatory vaccination. That's not in here. So those are things that really struck me right off the bat, that the union did not establish basically its facts that would be beneficial to unvaccinated workers, and it agreed with the city's evidence that was, not good for their clients.
I I I'm reminded of something I read a long time ago. This might be a little sensitive issue now with the war going on in the Middle East, but Israelis, when they're trying to figure out where there's like missile installations, like if they're looking for rockets in Iran, they put a map on the table and they kind of like lean back and they look at it from a distance to get a sense of the topology. I do the same thing with these court cases when I'm reading the ruling. I just skim through them and I try to gauge how much the judge hates the anti-vaxxers. And I got the sense from this one as well. Like the judge, I got a couple of paragraphs in. I'm like, yeah, there's no way this judge is ruling in favor. I don't know. Did you get that sense?
Well, when I looked at it, it was obvious they're not going to rule in favor of the union, but I don't even know if the arbitrator really had much of a decision to make, because when the union's like, yeah, we agree with what the city's saying, but here are some very minor things that we didn't agree with, why wouldn't the arbitrator rule in favor of the city, especially given all the other cases where arbitrators have ruled in favor of the employer, right? So when you look at what did the union argue? What was it? Let's see. They didn't like the fact that it was a blanket approach. Okay, yes, that is not good. But really, that's your hard-hitting main message. It was a blanket approach. And then they also talked about how they felt the city just took whatever was the cheapest, easiest route. And I'm thinking, all right, but right there, you're actually in some way giving the city even more ammunition, because you're basically saying that to not require vaccination would be, more resource heavy, more expensive, more inconvenient. I mean, it's a ridiculously weak stance. And then the only other thing really that the union pushed was, the vaccine's immunity waned, and we think that maybe the city was overly harsh. Really? You're overly harsh? Like, you kind of agree with it, but they went a little too far? That's how it reads to me. It's just ridiculous. This is a very weak presentation from the union.
Uh, I'm gonna pretend like I'm supporting the union. Could you make an argument that the union would have said, all right, listen, these judges, none of them listened to any criticism of the vaccines, so let's just not even bother going down that road?
Not at all. That's ridiculous. First of all, it's very easy to go through the timeline of events. These are just recorded events that are factual in nature, and they pretty much prove the union's case without having to even attack, what scientists have said about the safety and efficacy. You can see from the timeline that their narrative is wrong without even attacking the so-called science behind it. These are the facts, right? I would go further and challenge, because the timeline shows that these experts are wrong. I would actually challenge the science behind them. I would actually challenge their expert, I would challenge the science table, for example, and I would challenge the Public Health Agency of Canada. I would challenge what they've put forth. So, I mean, I would have taken, I would take a much more bold and offensive kind of position. I wouldn't concede to any of these points that the union conceded to. But we can go over some specifics that I thought some people might look at it and think it's not so bad that the union agreed with certain statements. And I look at it and I don't see it that way. If you want to look at a couple statements, Feynman.
Sure, go ahead.
Let's see. I'm just going to grab their ruling here. Here's one on number 16. All right. I think we both highlighted this one. What it reads is, there is no dispute that at all material times from the fall of 2021 to May 1st, 2023, that COVID-19 presented a serious risk for employees and members of the general public, particularly to the very young, elderly, and medically vulnerable individuals. So that statement right there, I have huge issues with this statement. Do you care to comment on it?
Let me bring it up. Sorry.
Yeah. So number
You
16.
said 16.
Yeah.
There it is. I did highlight it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you did.
Yeah, I again, if you're wondering why I highlighted these like this, I just go through and I'm in a very like disinterested, I've lost the will to live kind of way. I just highlight the main parts. So there's no dispute at all. This is the judge, by the way, saying this. This isn't either party. So like when a judge uses a phrase like "there's no dispute at all," I'm like, yeah, you're gonna lose the case. A serious risk, particularly to the very young. So, sorry, could you repeat the question?
So, well, first of all, there is no dispute that, is the arbitrator basically saying that neither parties disputed that, or just there's no dispute in general in the world? I took it to mean that there was no dispute from the two parties based on other things that I read further in this ruling. But yeah, either according to her, she does not feel there was any dispute regarding the serious risk for employees and members of the general public. So that's a blanket statement right there, right? But then particularly to the very young, elderly, medically vulnerable individuals. So I'm just wondering what you felt was wrong with this statement. I kind of know what you think, but if you can articulate, because I find a lot wrong with this statement.
Yeah, for me, what's wrong is the judge is. If I was gonna take a step back, like I'd say the judge is biased. Like he's bringing his worldview into the courtroom based on what the media has told her, and this is setting a foundation, and it's basically kneecapping the plaintiff.
Right, and then I look at this statement, and it is a very general statement. A serious risk. What is meant by a serious risk? That's a very subjective term. You're looking at for employees and members of the general public. That's blanket. That's really for everybody, but in particular the very young and the elderly. When I look at this, if I was fighting on behalf of unvaccinated individuals, I would look at this kind of information and basically want the details spelled out. I have no problem talking about the risk of COVID-19, but why not talk about the specifics? Why not state that basically the infection fatality rate for individuals under age 70 is around 0.05%. Right? It's comparable to the seasonal flu, and it's been shown to be even less risky than the seasonal flu for young people. That's what the estimates say, right? We can look at the average age of a COVID-19 death and write down, that's 84, and they generally on average have, 4 comorbid conditions. Why not go into the specifics, and then people can judge for themselves the seriousness of this COVID-19. Also, that as it stands, most people have gotten COVID-19. So these are specifics that would provide context to the seriousness of COVID-19. And I know later on in this that the judge does talk about context for the city, not in context of the COVID-19 seriousness, but context of the restrictions that were put in place. And she mentioned how context is important. Well, I'm mentioning that context is important here. We need to put this serious, virus in context and let people decide, at least give some people an idea of what they mean by serious.
I think the phrase I should have used when I was answering your question is, to me, the judge here is taking judicial notice of the seriousness of the virus.
She may be. I'm not sure, because later on she does talk about how the neither party, like the union, did not dispute the evidence from the Canadian, from the Ontario Science Table and whatnot. Let's see if I can find that in here.
Tell me what section.
Da, 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 da. Yeah, I should have wrote it down. Oh, wait, 32 and 34, I think. Let's see, 32, 34. Da, da, da. 32, 34, there's more. Do you have that up? 32, 34. And also later on, she talks about it several times. I should have wrote it down. My apologies.
That's okay.
Well, yeah, and I'll leave it here for a second, but also in 108, as noted, there was no dispute that vaccines are a safe and effective method of protection against COVID-19. The argument advanced by the union was that there were other less intrusive measures, such as rapid antigen testing. So if you look at 108 as well, this one, it looks like the unions were in agreement that these vaccines are a safe and effective method of protection.
Again, I take like just like a non-legal view. Like when you start agreeing with the other side, you end up usually losing the argument. I'm not saying you should never agree, but this seems like it would have really helped their case.
Well, the issue here, of course, is what do they mean by safe and what do they mean by effective? It's a very, very general statement, and over what time period and for whom. Like, these are very blanket general statements that when you agree to it, you're making it very easy for the arbitrator to say, all right, everything was fine. The union did a good job. I mean, the city did the right thing with the mandates. So, and again, why would a union agree to that the vaccine was effective when we have actual, official government data showing that vaccinated individuals had higher incident rates than unvaccinated during Omicron? Right there, how are you saying that this is effective against what? Certainly not infection. I mean, we have government issued data that says this is a false statement, at least when it comes to infection. But yet you have the union agreeing with something that does not help its case. It actually works against its unvaccinated workers. Why would there be no dispute about this? Why would there be no specifics? So I do take really big issue with that. And yeah.
Any other sections before I stop sharing?
Well, I guess when I read a lot of this, I think that I have an issue a lot of times when I read these things when the I don't know. Sorry about I keep trying to turn my phone off, but apparently I'm failing. I'm just gonna turn this off. Sorry. I have issues when the statements are very, very general, because that the specifics actually help people who are in the situation that they were unvaccinated. So you should really, I would push for specifics. And it's also interesting because the union is arguing against a blanket approach, but they're allowing for these blanket generalizations. So I found that also interesting.
I'm gonna stop sharing, I guess.
Yeah.
Or is there more?
Um, well, let's go back to 30 and 32. Or is it 30,
30?
32 and 34? So 32 and 34 talks about, yes, 34 struck me. The parties relied on the various science briefs issued by the advisory table as independent and credible scientific facts. I personally would have argued against both those things. I would argue that they were not independent. At least they weren't independent with respect to pharmaceutical companies, because a lot of them have affiliations with big pharma. And I would argue against them bringing forth credible scientific facts. But myself personally, because I've looked into the Ontario Science Table and looked at what they've done to the data and what they've presented, um, I'm looking at what kind of manipulations they made to the Ontario data, especially during the Omicron surge, that I would describe as fudging the data to make the infections amongst the unvaccinated appear higher. And so, yeah, to me, the Ontario Science Table, I can show that they fudged the numbers to help prop up or help support these vaccine mandates in the workplace.
Sorry,
And I
can you tell us what is the advisory table?
So yeah, the Ontario Science Advisory Table, that's another thing. This was a self-appointed group that was an initiative of the Dalai Lama School of Public Health from the University of Toronto. And this group of experts got together, and they advised the Ontario government and public health about COVID-19. So in here, it does talk about number 33, that their role was to review information and review studies from around the world, and then provide summaries of relevant, credible, and independent scientific evidence to the public health and public health care professionals. So that was their role. That's what they were supposed to do. But when you look at what they actually did, if this was their role, they really should have advised the government not to, I believe if they were to follow this, they should have advised the Ontario government not to implement harsh policy based on the just observational data. But instead, they pushed for mandates. They pushed for harsh measures and restrictions. So I have an issue with that, with the Ontario Science Table. Really, they should have pointed out the issues with the data that was being collected, because there's a lot of issues with how the government was collecting its statistics. So I had mentioned that during Omicron, we did see, higher rates amongst the vaccinated groups, right? Higher COVID rates. But that was even after a lot of manipulations that made vaccination, that would bias the results in favor of vaccination. Okay. So I think most viewers probably are aware of the misclassification issues with these statistics, in that people who were, tested as COVID positive within 2 weeks of the first dose were misclassified as unvaccinated, and that you weren't considered fully vaccinated until 2 weeks after your second dose. Like, that kind of issue really impacts the statistics. And also, for unvaccinated people, they tend to underestimate the population size of unvaccinated. So when you look at their rates would appear higher than they actually are. So those are two huge issues with government, the government statistics. But even with those issues that favor vaccination, you do see that during the Omicron surge, that unvaccinated had lower rates than the vaccinated. So really the science advisory table should have been pointing out the limitations of the data instead of pointing to the data and say, hey, look, there's conclusive proof that these vaccines work and that mandates are a good way to go. And that's actually, the science table did say that there is, conclusive evidence regarding the vaccines in terms of safety and efficacy. And that's just clearly not the case. But like I said, we can actually go further and show how the table itself, the science table itself, took the Ontario data and applied some methodology that artificially inflated the incident rates amongst the unvaccinated.
Before we do that, I'm going back. Not that I like unions, I don't, but could you instead blame this on the culture where the judges just defer to the experts on matters of science in a way that they don't in matters of like a criminal investigation?
Well, I think it would have been up to I would actually ask who the union consulted in terms of scientific experts to look at the evidence. And did they commission or consult any scientists or researchers to look over what the city was submitting? Or did they just say, yes, we'll just go with whatever these experts said? Because another thing here, for example, remember, this is interesting. The Ontario Science Table, they advised the Ontario government, and they advised the Ontario government in the fall of 2021 to bring in mandates in healthcare services. But the Ontario government did not take that advice. That's kind of important. Why didn't they take that advice? Okay, the health minister did not agree that that was the way to go. He actually talked about, later on, he talked about having a more catered risk-benefit assessment done for the individuals and to look at, the actual risk for particular individuals of getting, COVID or serious COVID. So right here, why wasn't that presented in this case? Or was it presented and I just don't see it in this ruling?
I take it they didn't consult you.
Well, I just wonder if they consulted anyone that would help their case. Like right now, they conceded to, a lot of evidence that supports the city. But another issue that I have with a lot of the stuff that I see here is I see a lot of scientific opinions. I don't see a lot of facts. It's their opinion that it's safe and effective. Well, the facts show me the actual facts. Like when I go through the timeline, to me, those are verifiable facts that people can look up and say, yep, that's what happened at this time. But when I read this, I see a lot of expert opinion, and I see expert opinion that flies in the face of what actually happened. So yeah, I have an issue with that.
No, I agree with you. Are there any other sections you want to go over?
Um, I think that in order for, I personally believe that in order for any of these cases to be successful, like for the unions and anybody challenging, the safe and effective, I think you do actually have to challenge. You do have to challenge the credibility and the information given by experts such as Ontario Science Table, Public Health Agency of Canada, and others. And one of the issues that I also had is when one of the things that I think was mentioned really early on in this, I can't remember what number, maybe 12 or 16, is right in the beginning, where both parties, I think both parties, yes, it is number 12. Sorry, Payman, but
Nope,
the
I'll go back.
parties agree.
Keep going. I'll find it.
Okay, the parties agree that information released to the public by OPH, I guess that's Ottawa Public Health, I think, or is it Ontario? Oh, Ottawa Public Health, regarding vaccination variants, etc., is independent and credible information. Um, this evidence was relied upon by the parties in their arguments, and it forms the basis for my findings. So the parties right here agreed, both parties agreed that the information from this source was independent and credible information. And of course, Ottawa Public Health, it gets its information as well from the Ontario Science Table and PHAC and other sources. So this is another blanket statement that they agree that what are they saying here? Any information coming from them is going to be right, that they're never wrong. Like, I don't even know how to interpret this statement. What do they mean by it's independent and credible information? Does that mean you can't challenge anything? Does that mean, because if they're getting their information from the Ontario Science Table and from PHAC, those are very large, PHAC, those are large associations. They're not right on everything. And this kind of gives it a blanket, they're credible. Why not look at the various pieces of information and assess whether those pieces of information themselves are credible based on what we know?
This is what I was saying earlier. I think you articulated it much better than I do. Like, I'm
I don't
reading
think
this,
so.
I get to like section 12. I'm like, yeah, all right, fine. They shot themselves in the foot there. They shot themselves in the foot here, and they're not really putting up a good argument.
A good argument. Did they put up any argument?
Okay,
No, no,
they're not putting up any.
they're not putting up any. Their big argument was the vaccines waned. But the city's like, yep, they did. Like, they're not even denying that. And the judge is like, yeah, that's okay. These vaccines don't have to be perfect. And I'm like, perfect? I know. What if they're negative? Like what if you're not even getting positive efficacy? You're getting negative efficacy. I mean, the data actually shows you guys, that the vaccinated had higher rates. That isn't not being perfect. That is like tremendously failing, and actually could be argued that you're putting people at risk for forcing them to take this in terms of infections and transmission. So I would have taken that approach. I would have said, oh no, I wouldn't just say they waned. I would say, basically the city's stance put the public and put its workers at risk. And I would, you make a strong argument on that. And they didn't.
Another.
Instead,
Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say another thing I noticed when reading this. It's almost David versus Goliath. So you have the city, which is the government. You have the judge, which is with his bias, I just say he's the government. And then you got all these three-letter agencies in there, like the OPH and that table or whatever. That's the government too. So like all of this, it's I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like you're a slave and you're navigating through somebody else's society.
Well, I think, Payman, if you or I were arguing it, it would be like a David versus the Goliath, because we would actually fight. But that's not what the unions know David. The unions gave it to them. The union gave it to them. That's what I see. Like, they didn't make a case at all for their unvaccinated workers. And I don't see how it would have even been difficult to do so. Just going through the timeline alone makes these mandates look absurd. It makes them look, and they know it. I mean, if you look at what was happening in 2021, 2022, what happened in the beginning of 2022 when Omicron hit, Heyman? We had the huge, we had the Freedom Convoy. The Freedom Convoy came here and said these mandates are basically ridiculous. We all know they don't stop transmission, and we're having record outbreaks now that everybody's vaccinated. If they put so much pressure on the federal government, the provinces, that the provinces relented, and then ultimately the federal government relied on a fraudulent study by FISMIN to keep their mandates going. I mean, you're seeing the data was so bad that are they're resorting to fraud. That's what you see. And these unions don't mention it. Don't go there. It's like, come on. There's no excuse for it. They're no David.
Before I want to touch on one more thing the conflict of interest you talked about. But before we get to that, when I'm talking to you, I'm noticing that you and we live in two completely different worlds. So you're a statistician, you have a PhD, and you live in the world of the data. So you know exactly what's going on. Me, I live in the world of the media. So I just look at the media and I'm thinking like, all right, I know they're lying, but I also know that a big chunk of the population is going to buy these lies. So I just find it funny how like um, do you get my position though?
Well, I think that you're also aware of the data, right? Like I talked to you, and at least you appear to be.
No. What I mean is like I'm aware of the data, but I look at this judge. I'm like, all right, it's probably a brain dead judge that watches the CBC, believes everything the CBC says. So in her mind, this was a deadly, once in a lifetime bubonic plague, and the vaccine worked 100% of the time.
Well, suppose that's the case. Well, let's suppose that wasn't the case. That's even better. Suppose she knows that this didn't really work. Okay, that's her personal opinion, and she's going into this negotiation, and both the city and the union is saying, "Hey, no, we both think it's serious. We think it was like so serious until like 2023, and that you know these things had to be done." But the union's like, they just went a little far. They were a little bit meany. That's what I see. So then if the arbitrator is hearing both parties saying this was very serious and they had to do something, even if that arbitrator didn't quite agree, could she even go against that? If both parties are on the same page saying, yep, it's very, 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 very serious. Like,
This is a unique case. I'm not going to deny like the union should give the members fees back for this one.
well, I think actually more should, but I'll keep that to myself. But I mean, I don't want to give anybody, legal advice. All I'm saying is when I look at this, it looks like the union threw the case. They did not try to win. They certainly didn't represent their workers. And like you said, or that you mentioned that we will get into the conflicts of interest. When I read it, I see a clear conflict of interest. So I would even argue that they shouldn't have been the ones to argue the case, that there's too much of a conflict of interest and they could not properly advocate for unvaccinated workers because it would put them in a terrible situation. And I seen that. What number did I highlight for that payments?
Oh, I know
Conflict.
what you're talking about. Well, you're finding that. While you're
I think
looking
number
for that,
68.
68. All right.
Yeah.
If there's anyone in the audience that has a question, you can put it in the comments and I'll ask Miss Watteel. 68?
Yeah, 68. I think it says it pretty clearly here. Actually, 67 and 68. Yeah, the union argued strongly against the vaccination policies. Yeah, not okay. We see that differently. Okay, both parties' positions reflect the difficult balances they were required to undertake. The union needed to balance the safety of all of its members, but also the desire of its unvaccinated members to keep working and the desire of its vaccinated members not to be subjected to additional health risks as a result of working side by side with unvaccinated coworkers.
Oh, there it is.
I cannot believe that this made it into these arguments. Did the union actually argue that they had to consider the desire of vaccinated members not to be subjected to additional health risks as a result of working side by side with unvaccinated workers? This makes it look like the union believes that the unvaccinated were a greater risk to others. Is that not how it reads?
I'm not a legal expert, but to me, this is a admission of a conflict of interest, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a conflict of interest. What are they going to do? Like now you have a vaccinated majority and you have an unvaccinated minority. Is the union going to argue at all that these vaccines weren't necessary or were not safe and not effective? What would that do in terms of the people who are vaccinated? They didn't stop. You know what I mean? Like, I believe to represent the unvaccinated properly, I believe they should have argued that these vaccines were not only not effective, but there's now data indicating that you had a higher chance of getting infected if you took them, which would be horrible to say to your vaccinated population, right? But to argue the case for unvaccinated, that's where I believe it should go, because that is where the data goes, and not just the Ontario data, which is highly relevant since this is for Ontario, but you also have that evidence coming from the UK and also the US. So you have data from many sources saying, hey, there is an issue when it comes to these vaccines and its inability to stop or curtail transmission and infection. It's a huge issue. And instead, we have the union here basically going along with that false narrative that unvaccinated individuals are disproportionate risk to others. That's what they're doing here, which is horrific. Like this, they should not be doing that. And the fact that they are talking about having to balance the one group and the other group shows me that they're in a conflict of interest, and they weren't able to properly argue this case. That's
Yeah,
how
that's
I
my
see it.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's my takeaway as well. It's a conflict of interest. You don't need a law degree to see that.
Yeah, you don't. That's just it. Like you and I can look at this and plainly see a lot of critical deficiencies in this. Where does that leave the workers? I mean, what did it say in this? How many workers in the city of Ottawa with these policies? Did I read 17,000? Yeah. The city is a complex legislated entity with over 100 lines of business delivered through 9 departments and 17,000 employees. How many of those employees were put on leave of absence without pay? How many of those employees were not properly represented by this union? And what are they supposed to do now? I mean, my understanding is that if you have a union, you have to go through the union if you have a grievance first. Well, here we are, 2024. I think this ruling was made just a couple of weeks ago saying, yeah, too bad for you. And the union didn't, that's it. They just throw up their hands, and these guys are getting nothing after they were treated the way they were.
It sucks being in a union. I agree because um, it kind of makes sense when your employer is harming you and there's a process to go through the union. It kind of, but when your union's the one that threw the case and you have to go through it, and they slow walk these things. So if they have up to like a year to file a paper, they wait 365 days. Then they file
Yeah,
it.
I don't know what the process, like, I'm not sure what the timeline was for this particular case. But I mean, like you said, it's like, actually, no, they said they first came before the courts, I think, in winter of 2022. Is that not, that's stated in here. Um, but how much they delayed it versus the usual delays that you get, I don't know. So I can't speak to whether they purposely went slowly. But given that they've had a lot of time to come up with their points, um, they didn't do a good job at
I
all.
was my friend, she's fighting the BC Nurses Union. She's the one that tells me they slow walk everything. Um, it's a form of lawfare.
Yeah, they do that, but I have my sister, for example. Yeah, she's having issues. She wasn't unionized, and even the employer will just not provide information. They won't do things like it's not just unionized. It's not just the union. The employer, they're not hustling. They're dragging things out for sure.
Do you
Um,
want to talk about that actually? Just to finish up the episode, you mentioned your sister, that outrageous guy who made $500,000 as a nurse.
well, my issue is that I go on Twitter in the morning and with my coffee and my bagel, and I just look at what's going on, and then I see a post about a registered nurse in Alberta, Alberta Health Services, that made $500,000 in 2022, and has made several hundred thousand in the years leading up to that, right? And you look at $500,000 for a registered nurse, and that seems absurd. Like that's a really unusual amount of money from this male nurse, which is also unusual. There's not a lot of male nurses, but anyway, this male nurse, I don't remember his name again. I can go on Twitter, but he made $500,000 in 2022, and then it looks like he made well over 300,000 from Alberta Health Services in 2023. But then when you look closer, he actually transferred out of Alberta Health Services to Ontario Cambridge Memorial Hospital in 2023. So he has paid, 320 something thousand in AHS, if I have that number right, and another 175,000 in, Cambridge Memorial Hospital here in Ontario that same year. So he's close to $500,000 again in 2023. And so I look at Cambridge Memorial Hospital because, that's the hospital that is in my parents' neck of the woods. And I had siblings that worked there. And I know that they treated their unvaccinated workers horribly. All right. And they fired all their workers who were not vaccinated. And now you're bringing in an individual and paying these outrageous amounts of money. And I'm thinking, well, it's hard to contemplate when you see a registered nurse making $500,000 a year. And it's like, well, that's about the salary of 5 nurses, is it not? Around, you could get 5 nurses for one. And now you've fired a lot of unvaccinated individuals. You're short staffed. Like it's outrageous to me. Now I don't know the specifics, and I don't want to come down on this one guy because I'm not saying he's necessarily did anything wrong. I mean, I haven't looked into it, but certainly on the face of it, it looks like the hospitals have done something wrong. They fired unvaccinated workers. They were short staffed, and now they're hiring and paying these exorbitant amounts of money for one individual. And how much overtime can somebody possibly put in to make that kind of money? And then if you are putting that much overtime, it's like, how safe is that? And then how about the value to patients? You fire a bunch of, you could have 5 nurses for one. So what kind of care are you actually getting? What kind of care for your money are you actually getting? So these are questions that I would have. So when I see something like that, I'm at a loss of words. Like, how is that even possible? And so at first you think, oh, maybe maybe there was a typo, maybe the information isn't quite valid. So the links are provided, and there it is. It's $500,000 in 2022 in AHS, and there was even a newspaper article that went out on it. It was even in the paper. And in the following years, the person is out of AHS and into Ontario. So I'm like, oh, that also to me is, I would think it warrants an investigation, given everything that's been happening.
I'm just waiting. I put this in my post, but I'm just waiting for the government to come out and gaslight us. I'm trying to figure out what lie they'll put out for this guy making $500,000 a year.
Oh, and that's the thing. It's not just a one-off. 2022, 2023, and before that, it was very, very high. Do you have it in front of you, Payman? I don't know. Maybe I should try to get to it.
I got so many tabs open.
Oh yeah.
Found.
Yeah, you're looking 510,000 in 2022, and then you're looking at 350,000 the year before, 309,000 the year before that. And then, when you look at 2023, and it only shows 320,000, then you realize that that's only for partial year, and the other part of the year he was at Canadian Memorial Hospital making another 175,000. Yeah, this is, yeah. And like I said, in 2023, apparently he went to he transferred to Ontario, made an additional 175. So that's a lot of money, and I do have questions because these hospitals claim to be short-staffed, and they claim to need more money, and meanwhile you have unvaccinated staff that still to this day cannot find a job. And I'm not just talking a job in healthcare. A lot of them can't find a job anywhere because, these hospitals like CMH, they actually wrote down that these people were terminated with cause for not getting that vaccine. With cause. That's on their record of employment. So they're having a hard time finding employment in other hospitals and anywhere. Meanwhile, 500,000 for one guy. My God.
Uh, what little insight I have into this, a friend of mine, she said there's another issue where the ones that were terminated, the nurses, uh, in BC, they just announced that they're willing to hire them back. But then if they come back, they're kind of pariahs because the people that stayed, they look at them and they're like, oh, these are the loser nurses. These are the weak ones that gave up, and we were the ones fighting on the front lines. So it's created this sort of animosity.
Well, the animosity was pretty obvious throughout the pandemic, actually, especially 2021 was a very hostile. I think it was a very hostile environment in hospitals in general. Like I have a couple siblings who were working in hospitals throughout the pandemic, at least uh, throughout the pandemic until the one was fired. So then after that, she didn't work. But I have siblings. It was hostile in 2022 because they were trying to get these people to take the vaccine before the mandate came in, and there was a lot of pressure and um, animosity put against those who didn't vaccinate well before the mandates. Uh, it was a very toxic environment for many people. I know my sister had a horrible time. It was awful for her. The stress was like you could see it. You could see how stressful the situation was. It was hard for me to watch, actually. Um, so yeah, and my other sibling, my brother, he would say, yeah, he heard people in the hospital, doctors saying, that they didn't want to treat the unvaccinated. So it's like, wait, that's kind of dangerous. That's not good. Um, so you can just imagine they didn't have a lot of regard for unvaccinated staff. Some of these people. So yeah, it's very. My heart goes out to these individuals who lost their jobs and who are still being treated so poorly. And I was
Yeah,
I was actually sharing with you one of the things with the hospital, what the hospital wrote when they were asked questions about the vaccine. Do you want me to read that or no?
sure, go ahead. This doesn't ring any bells, but go ahead.
No, it's like so when the mandates were coming out, some of the workers did ask questions regarding this novel technology and questions regarding the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. Um, and for informed consent, the employer is supposed to provide that information uh, to the employee. So an individual had written to the hospital, their employee, about the vaccines and asked for information. And the hospital wrote back, here's a quote: "The questions you have posed in your email are more appropriately directed to the World Health Organization and/or Health Canada, the organizations whose scientists extensively studied and ultimately approved the vaccinations contemplated by our vaccination policy." So you have the hospital basically telling the employee that her questions should have been directed to the WHO, the World Health Organization. Like it's and then they have the nerve to tell people like, oh, you're conspiracy theorists, like and it's like you actually directed your employee to talk to the WHO to answer questions about the vaccination that you are mandating that we take. Like it's
I misunderstood you the first time when you told me that. For some reason, I thought you said they referred them to the World Economic Forum, but still, the
oh
WHO
no
is
no,
just as
it's the
bad.
WHO. It's the World Health Organization. Yeah, so it's just yeah, it's a bizarre. The whole thing is bizarre.
I
Anyway.
think there's too much government, way too many three-letter agencies, and there's just too much money floating around. Like this guy that's getting 500,000. When you have a, what do we got, $2.5 trillion economy, $500 billion budget? Who's gonna notice if I steal a couple of hundred grand?
Well, whether it's stolen or not, the point is that these hospitals are claiming that they, are strapped for cash, and they're also strapped for workers. And then you see them giving nurses, a nurse this kind of money, and then firing healthy workers. So they're saying one thing, but their actions show completely the opposite. And I have more of an issue with the management of resources than this particular individual, because it could very well be that this individual was able to do that, and that's just how it is. I don't know. I don't. It doesn't give a lot of details as to why he was able to, get 500,000 in salary for being a registered nurse. That information isn't available, or I haven't seen it. So it could very well be he just put in a heck of a lot of overtime, and in which case you're looking at the hospital and you're thinking, how is your hospital being managed? What's going on here? Is this safe for your patients to be understaffed and then have an individual perhaps who's working back-to-back shifts and being extra tired? Like, I don't know. Like, this is something that should be asked for to the hospitals about their management, their resource management. So,
Yeah,
and
something's
especially,
definitely gone wrong.
well, yeah, and it just because that yeah, they treated a lot of their workers very, very poorly, and then you see this. So yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, that's just an email that caught me this morning. And usually, I not email, it's Twitter. So right away when I see that kind of thing, I do click on the links, because I'm like, oh, is this credible information? But yeah, the sources, they checked out, and the paper did even write about it in Alberta. When they found out, there was an article written, and now there's this, and it's on the websites. The Anyway.
All right. Well, we're at the end of the episode. Do you want to your book? I actually have two copies of it now. I've only read it once, but do you want to just tell people where they can go and get a copy of it?
Um, yeah, the my book Fismus Fraud: The Rise of Canadian Hate Science. The easiest place to get it, I guess, is either Amazon or Indigo. It's online, so it'd have to be ordered online. Um, it does play into some of the things we talked about, in that what I'm able to do in this book is to completely obliterate that whole pandemic of the unvaccinated, right? And show how organizations, basically how the government relied on a fraudulent study to prop up its mandates and passports. But it does more than that, in that it shows how top organizations were complicit in the fraud. So how the University of Toronto, CIHR, Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and the journal, the Canadian Medical Association journal, when they were presented with evidence of the fraud, they continued to endorse study and to endorse these researchers. And to this day, they still have. So it does implicate top organizations in the fraud. So I find that is the power of the book that I wrote, in that it doesn't leave any wiggle room for what happened. And also, when you're looking at fraud, it's usually difficult to establish, but in this case, it was so blatant. It's textbook fraud that is provable, and it shows intent to deceive. So that's extremely important. So that's a place to start. And like I said, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, they continue to fund Fisman, and they continue to fund an updated study where he doubles down on the same false narrative that the unvaccinated are disproportionate risk to others. So this is still happening now. The updated study just went out, I think, in mid-April, basically doubling down on the falsehood. And when you look at CIHR, they've funded several bogus studies that were led by Dr. Fisman. So this is a big issue. So I'm still on it. I'll probably be updating my supplementary guide soon. So I have a supplementary guide, Fisman's Fraud: The Accomplices, where I have all the letters that I went back and forth with them. And I've just sent out a whole new batch in June, July, because it's ongoing. So I will include that in the updated version. And from there, I think it's important to look at, like, this wasn't just a one-off. You do have other experts that are fudging the data, like I mentioned with the Ontario Science Table. So yeah, I'll be writing more about that in the future. But this is a good place to start. And this helps also build the case where you can attack the credibility of the experts that have been used to push this narrative. right? So it's not just hearsay. You can actually prove these cases. You can prove the fraud. You can prove that data was fudged. And I think that we have to in order for somebody to start winning these cases and start bringing people to account, and also to bring in the protections against future mandates. So sorry, I kept going on, Payman.
No, it's fine. I actually have a follow-up question. But before that, Peter Biker, he says he learned a lot from the interview. So you reached at least one person. um,
Well, I mean, I want to be, somewhat optimistic. I mean, the issue I'm having is that we have ethics on our side, we have the Constitution on our side, we actually have the data on our side, but yet you see these rulings like we see with the Union versus the City of Ottawa, and this shouldn't be happening, but it is, and so we have to figure out how we can go about fighting this and actually winning. But we cannot win if we do not have those who are supposed to be fighting on our behalf actually tossing the case. So, I mean, really, yeah.
yeah, it's a bit of a hiccup. Just one,
Okay.
one quick follow-up question. Uh, would you say that um, like the sin of Fisman's fraud, what Fisman did that in any way contribute to these court cases that we keep losing? Like did that lie plant the seed that grew into this judge buying into that lie?
Well, Fisman's fraud was well. What the Fisman study actually did. Number one, it was used, like I said, in Parliament to extend the travel restrictions, the federal travel restrictions and mandates. But it was also highly publicized across Canada and globally, and it really reinforced the pandemic of the unvaccinated narrative. And it attempted to give scientific legitimacy to that. So I would think that through media influence, it did help bolster that false narrative. It made it look like they actually had, data to back the fact that, to back what they were claiming in terms of unvaccinated posing a disproportionate risk. And so that's the main influence probably from Fisman, more on the federal government side, and then the media. The media was really, really big with that. On our side, Fisman's case is extremely important because it's a textbook case of fraud. It implicates top research institutions. So when I look at this, I look at it as the Achilles heel, that it could actually take down the scam. It could take down, it could take down the whole narrative, and it could bring about accountability. That's why I keep pushing. That's why I don't want people to give up on this particular study, because it's rare to see a case so obvious. Like the Fisman's case was such blatant fraud that I was able to name the book Fisman's Fraud, because that's how solid the evidence is, right? And it hasn't been refuted by anybody. And they haven't come after me. Why? Because not only is it solid, but since that time, the case has only gotten stronger against him, because they've doubled down, and then they've put out additional bogus studies that I can show are also bogus. So I just see this case getting stronger against him, and also the institutions, they've continued to back him. I've gone back with University of Toronto, and again, they've backed his latest studies, including not only the update to this, but they backed this, a bogus masking study that is a joke. Like this when I look at Fisman's studies and what he has done, it actually makes me want to go into back to teaching, and show people how bad the fraud is, and show people how statistics can be manipulated and what to look for. It actually makes me want to go teach, because these are just beautiful textbook cases of fudging data and fraud. So yeah, so I don't know. I think I've went on a little bit.
No, I think it might be time for you to go back to teaching then.
Well, I mean, I've never seen anything like it. I'm telling you, Payman, like I look at Fisman stuff, and we really we need the masses to have the will to bring down that fraudulent study and bring down the researchers who backed the government's fraudulent measures. Like sorry, we need to go after the individuals who conducted the fraudulent science that backed these measures. We do need to do that. And the best place that I can see to start is with FSMN, because the evidence is right there. It's laid out. But from there, we can go further. And it, particularly to me, it looks bad for, I have to say, University of Toronto. All right, because FSMN was out of the University of Toronto, but the Ontario Science Table, that was an initiative of the University of Toronto, and a lot of people who served on the Ontario Science Table were affiliated with the University of Toronto. And I've gone back and forth with the University of Toronto Ethics Department, and they're backing the nonsense. So I feel they're compromised. And of course, I'm not sure if everybody knows, but yeah, the University of Toronto received quite a bit of money from the federal government to combat vaccine hesitancy, as did, many universities. But they also have a strong partnership with Moderna. So they have a clear conflict of interest, and they're not investigating, clearly fraudulent studies. And yeah, I think I think we have to continually drill down that line. So
I'm assuming this conflict of interest you're pointing out is exactly the stuff that should have been in the union's argument in the court case, but it wasn't.
oh, it should have been. When you're looking at the evidence put forth by what they're considering independent, they said independent, researchers, an independent group. Independent of who? Maybe they've specified it and it's just not in this ruling. They could possibly mean independent of government, but they're not independent of the pharmaceutical industry. And we're talking about vaccine mandates that, are good for the pharmaceutical industry. So it's important for them to be independent of that. Also, independent does not mean they're a representative of the scientific community, right? These were self-appointed people. Like they are self-appointed experts saying, hey, listen to us. We're the experts and we all think the same thing, because otherwise you're not on our team. Like, they're not exactly diverse opinions in there. A lot of them are for harsh government policy. And they were like that. If you look back at what they were saying in the fall of 2021, when it was already known that vaccines didn't stop transmission, when it was already known that there was huge outbreaks in vaccinated venues, at that time, they were pushing for mandates. They asked the Ontario government, they recommended that the Ontario government bring in mandates for healthcare workers. They did that. But like I said, Karine Moore, he did not take that advice. So obviously, he didn't feel the same way they did. But that wasn't in the union's case.
Just want to round off the show with a funny comment from a union member. Can you please email a copy of your book to a union president in Toronto?
Oh, really, they should have a copy. I mean, if they're still buying into that the unvaccinated are a greater risk, then they need the book. They need to be set straight. That's absurd.
It's a shame it's still going on in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, it's still going on. I'd like to see. It'd be great if to know how many people are fighting this, and what the next steps are for union members who were not properly represented by their union. Not sure what they're doing next. I mean, it's expensive to fight these battles. So, and a lot, that's another issue, right? You have people who are put on leave of absence without pay. Are they going to have the funds to pay lawyers to fight, their unions or their employers when, they may or may not win, depending on how fair the courts are. Like, it's very difficult for individuals in this situation.
Right.
So anyway.
Go ahead.
No, I'm good. I ramble a little too much, so I apologize, and not always the most articulate in these interviews.
No, it's fine. You're doing a better job than me.
Oh, so is there anything else that you wanted? I didn't get to a lot of your questions. You had questions, Payman.
No. That was the previous, before the Ontario, union thing. So we just changed everything.
Yeah. Sorry, I get worked up when I see this kind of thing. It shouldn't be happening, and it is. And I think it's also meant to discourage people, right? So uh, the union didn't really lose. The union just simply didn't present a case that could possibly win. So you can look at it that way, um, which is the way I'm looking at it.
No, like you said, they threw the case.
Well, that is my opinion. It is my opinion that based on all the evidence showing all the evidence in favor of the unvaccinated workers, and there's a lot, that yes, I can't see this any other way. So,
All right, Regina, we'll get you back on next time there's another horrible court case.
well, maybe there'll be, a good one. Like,
I won't hold my breath.
yeah, well, all right. No, that's good. When I do my updated companion guide, I'll send you a copy there, Payman.
Sounds
Since you
good.
got two of the other ones, I'll give you.
Make sure it's a hard copy.
Okay. Yeah,
All right. Thanks
we'll do.
again. Take care, Regina.
Bye.
Bye.